The Language Police is a new book from former Assistant Secretary of Education, Diane Ravitch. She spoke about it recently at Harvard University for about an hour.
On behalf of Drew Faust, who is Dean of the Radcliffe Institute of Advanced Studies, and my colleagues here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, I am delighted to have the opportunity to introduce Diane Ravitch. Diane and I were graduate students together, and I won't tell you how long ago it was, but it was quite a long time ago, at Teachers College. And we've remained in touch ever since. And one summer we even rented houses next door to each other on Martha's Vineyard. Diane is a person of tenacious curiosity. Her first book, The Great School Wars, grew out of a fairly straightforward question Diane had about the New York City public schools. And in pursuit of those fairly straightforward questions, Diane not only wrote a book, which after she wrote it and published it became her dissertation at Columbia. She doesn't always do things in the correct order. But in addition to resulting in a book, her question introduced her to Lawrence Kremen, who became her and my mentor. Currently, Diane is a research professor at the Steinhardt School of Education at NYU, and she also holds the Brown Chair in Education Policy at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. She serves on the National Assessment Governing Board, having served earlier under the first President Bush as Assistant Secretary of Education. Diane's tenacious curiosity has led not only to the Great School Wars, which I think remains, almost 30 years later, the definitive history of education in New York City, but to many other books, some of them historical and some of them about education policy. And she tells me she's about to do a book with her son on English poetry, right? Diane has lectured all over the world. She has collected honorary degrees all over the country, and she has accumulated an innumerable number of honors that I am not going to bore you with. She is going to talk tonight about her newest book, The Language Police, which, as always with Diane, started out with a fairly simple question and just became quite a saga. Diane.
Thank you. Well, it's great to be here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and I thank Drew Faust, and especially my old and dear friend Ellen Lageman. As Ellen mentioned, we were graduate students together, but what she didn't tell you was that I started graduate school 12 years later than she did, so she is excused from being a member of my generation. Well, I'm here tonight too at their invitation to speak about the language police. I have to say, first of all, I had so much fun writing this book. It's never happened to me before as a historian to actually wake up in the morning and be excited about what I was going to write about, because I did something that I had never done before. I wrote the book in the first person, and it became, for me, a detective story. And I have to explain how this came to be. I think that I stumbled across a major scandal in American education. It involves censorship and speech codes and big business and state policies that limit competition and the political activities of pressure groups that dumb down textbooks and tests. And how this came about was that in 1997, President Clinton decided, and he announced in his State of the Union address, that he thought there should be a voluntary national test in both 4th grade reading and 8th grade math. And he assigned the development of this, what was called the VNT, the Voluntary National Test, to the National Assessment Governing Board. As it happened, he appointed me to that board, and I joined it in the first meeting of 1998. And the board immediately began reviewing test questions for the Voluntary National Test. Now, the Voluntary National Test never came to be because Congress never authorized it. Everybody except the public hated the idea. It showed very well in the opinion polls, but Democrats didn't like the idea, Republicans didn't like the idea, and it just didn't go anywhere. But I learned something that to me was incredible. I was on the committee reviewing test questions, test passages for 4th graders, and we were reading passages, stories that were 2 and 3 pages long, that 4th graders would read and that questions would be based on. And our committee, which was composed of, I don't know, a dozen or so people, educators for the most part, read the passages, approved them, and about a year later, a bunch of these passages were returned to us, and we were told that they had to be eliminated because they had not passed what was called a bias and sensitivity review. And this was news to me. I knew nothing about bias and sensitivity review, but let me tell you some of the stories that we were told couldn't be included and why they couldn't be included. One was a history of peanuts, and it was about George Washington Carver and the cultivation of the peanut. And it seemed like a pretty nice story, but the bias and sensitivity review panel said that we couldn't include it because some children are allergic to peanuts. And so that story had to go. That children would be very sensitive, they wouldn't be able to complete the test, things like that. Then there was a story about the owl and how the owl had a kind of radar that allowed it to find its prey at night. And they said this story could not be included because there are some cultures in this country to whom the owl is taboo. It represents death. And therefore, owls should never again be represented on standardized tests. So the owl doesn't exist anymore as far as standardized test makers are concerned. A third story, which was a true story, was about a young man who was blind who became the first blind man to ascend Mount McKinley. I point out that he was not the first blind person to ascend Mount McKinley because a blind woman had ascended it before him. However, he was the first blind man to ascend Mount McKinley. He did so in an ice storm, and it was presented as a rather heroic tale that accented his courage. The bias and sensitivity reviewer said this passage could not be used, first of all, because it contained regional bias. Children who had never been in an ice storm couldn't possibly understand what one was. And secondly, it was offensive to blind people because it suggested that it required courage on his part to climb Mount McKinley in an ice storm. And blindness should not be considered a handicap for these purposes. Then there was a story about it was a story about women in the 19th century and how they taught their daughters to make quilts. And it said that quilting was very important because it became part of the daughter's dowry. There were no commercially produced quilts, and so this was an important mother-daughter activity in the 19th century. And they said this story was gender biased. It showed women as soft and submissive and had to be eliminated. It was historically accurate, but that was irrelevant. Then there was a story, and it was a short biography of a man named Gutzon Borglum. He was the man who designed the sculptures on Mount Rushmore. And it was just a story of his life and how as a little boy he wanted to grow up to do monumental sculptures, and he did. And the bias and sensitivity reviewer said this story could not be used because Mount Rushmore was built on land that was sacred to the Lakota Indians, and it would offend Lakota children if Mount Rushmore was represented on a standardized test. So out it went. Then there was a wonderful environmental story about how a rotting stump in the forest is home to many different kinds of insects and animals. And it becomes, they called it the rotting stump apartment house, and how this was a way that nature recycles for all different kinds of creatures in the forest. And they said this had to go because it would be offensive and demeaning to children who live in housing projects. It seems to me that there are a lot of high-rise apartment buildings that are really expensive, but that was not relevant. And there were many other stories, but just one more that I'll mention. It was a story about Mary McLeod Bethune, who was an African-American woman who was a great educator, and it told the story of how she started a school in Daytona Beach, Florida. It was called the Daytona Industrial and Training School for Negro Girls, and it told her story, and they said this story could not be used for two reasons, actually for more than two reasons, but I'll only give you two. One is the name of her school, which used the word Negro, was offensive and could not be used. And the other was that it said that she was a tremendous fundraiser. She even managed to get money from John D. Rockefeller, who was apparently wintered in Daytona Beach. And the bias and sensitivity reviewer said we couldn't use that story because it showed her as dependent upon people like John D. Rockefeller and other white industrialists, and this was demeaning to Mary McLeod Bethune. It was true, but that was, again, irrelevant. So I found myself very puzzled about, where did this definition of bias and sensitivity come from? And I realized that while we were discussing this voluntary national test for reading, the publisher of the test, who had held a huge multi-million-dollar government contract, had given us a set of guidelines. And I went back and I looked at those guidelines and I thought everything that just got eliminated was described in the guidelines. It was described as biased, and it defined all these different kinds of bias. The publisher told us when he met with our committee to describe what would be in the reading section of the voluntary national test that everything written before 1970 was rife with either gender bias or racial bias, and so it would be hard to find any pre-1970 passages. He gave us, in these guidelines, a list of, about a 25-page list of words and topics and images and stereotypes that had to be avoided. And so what was considered sensitive would be anything that it would upset the test taker. So you can't have any reading passages that deal with catastrophes like, for instance, fires or earthquakes. You can't have anything that refers to scary creatures like rats or mice or lice or roaches. I mean, if a child read about a mouse on a test, they would just stop and not be able to complete the test. There should be nothing about giving birth, whether it's people or animals. There should be no reference to ghosts or witches or goblins or magic. There should be no reference to quarreling parents. There should be no stories about disobedient children. Anything that was remotely controversial would distract students and would cause their test scores to be lower. And anything that might make a student uncomfortable should be eliminated. Furthermore, anything that related to race or gender or age or disability or region or ethnicity or family was suspect and probably controversial and should probably be omitted. Well, the question that I asked myself as I looked at all of these passages that we were told were biased, and as I looked at these guidelines, which seemed, I mean, some of them were just alarming. You know, no questions about Halloween because Halloween implies witches, and you can't have anything about witches. No questions about fossils or dinosaurs because they imply evolution, and evolution can't be brought up. Well, I asked myself, how widespread is this? And I began contacting publishers and publishers of tests and also publishers of textbooks and asking them for their guidelines. And some of them quite cheerfully sent me their bias guidelines, which expanded on the ones that I already had. Others said that they didn't have guidelines, but I subsequently found out that they did, but don't like to release them to the public. Every publisher has guidelines with long lists of words and topics and stereotypes and images that you can't see on a test, and that in many cases you will not see in a textbook. State education departments have them, and they're everywhere. So what I did with this book was that I took all the bias guidelines that I could find, and I didn't find all of them, put them all together, collated them, and came up with a list of over 500 words that are banned today, either by test developers or by textbook publishers. I gathered bias guidelines from, just to give you some the main contributors, Macmillan McGraw-Hill, Scott Forsman, Addison Wesley, ETS, American Institutes for Research, Riverside Publishing, which publishes the Iowa Test of Basic Skills, National Evaluation Systems, which is involved in the MCAS, Houghton Mifflin, Harcourt, and a number of states, including California, New York, Connecticut, Nebraska, Kentucky, and also from Massachusetts, as well, and I also collected some from professional associations. Some of the words that are banned, and this is part, again, of a list of over 500 words. You're not supposed to say founding fathers. You're supposed to refer to these people, gentlemen, guys, whatever they are, as founders or framers. I sort of thought the framers were the ones who put my house up, but I don't think so. They're now the ones who wrote the Constitution. You're not supposed to say brotherhood. The word brotherhood is banned. It's to be replaced with amity. So now we have the amity of community, because we cannot say the brotherhood of man. That's banned also. You're not to say cowboy or cowgirl. You're to replace that with cowhand. If that subject ever comes up, please remember it's cowhand. Lumberjack. You're to replace the term lumberjack with woodcutter. I got a letter from a teenage girl who said, I belong to the lumberjack club in my school. Shall we change our club name? I don't know. The word craftsmanship is banned. It's interesting that on this list of hundreds of words, almost all of them have a replacement or an alternative suggested by the publisher. For the word craftsmanship, there is no alternative, but it's gone. The word cult is gone. Heretic, extremist, fanatic, dogma. Words like Cult, heretic, extremist, fanatic, and dogma are banned because they're considered ethnocentric words. To you, someone may be an extremist, but to you, that person may be an extremist to you, but to the other person, you're an extremist. So the word has to go. The word America or Americans is not to be used to refer to citizens of the United States or people who are in the United States, because the word actually is supposed to represent all people who live in either North America or South America. Now, if you take all this too seriously, you cannot use the expression God bless America, because God is banned, bless is banned, and so is America. So forget about it. You're not to use the expression Middle East, and someone should please tell the New York Times and the Boston Globe about this. You're to use, instead of Middle East, you're supposed to say Southwest Asia. So next we're going to worry about the crisis in Southwest Asia, and you'll know next time what they're referring to. Henpecked husband, of course, is gone. There are no more henpecked husbands. You're not to say landlord or landlady. You're to replace that with owner. Words like crazy or idiot or imbecile or insane are gone. They're to be replaced with a person with a mental disability. So next time you get really angry at your brother or your spouse, you're to say, you're a person with a mental disability. You're not to use the term ombudsman. Minority group. Motherland or fatherland, you replace that with native land. And one of my favorites is, you're not to say Mother Russia. In case it's ever occurred to you to say Mother Russia, don't do it anymore. Instead, you're to replace that with Russia, vast land of rich harvest. Now, some of the topics that test makers have banned from test are passages about slavery, racial prejudice, witches, war, social problems, animal rights, animal abuse, Halloween, disobedient children, poverty, unemployment, expensive consumer goods. So, for instance, if a child were to be taking a test and read about some other child getting a new bicycle, and it was a really expensive bicycle, the child taking the test would be so upset and jealous that it would stop them in their tracks. So no more stories about people living in big homes, like Great Expectations. We should not have these great differences of wealth and poverty, so you won't see that anymore. Now, the other thing that's banned is birthday parties, because some children don't have birthday parties and they would feel bad. And also birthday cake is banned, because that's not a nutritious kind of food. Well, all of this stuff goes on, and I have to tell you, I know from my experience that I have not found all of the language codes, because I keep finding funny words in textbooks. And so I created a website. It's called languagepolice.com, and I've invited people to send me bias guidelines that I haven't seen yet. I continue to discover things that have been banned since my book was finished. The New York State Regents, as you probably remember about a year ago, got a lot of national and even international attention when it was discovered, a vigilant parent discovered that they had been sanitizing famous literary passages. They were taking words and phrases out of the short stories of people like Franz Kafka and Isaac Bashevis Singer. There was a short story of Isaac Bashevis Singer about life in Poland that had to do with Jews and Gentiles, only they removed the references to Jews and Gentiles. So it was kind of hard to understand the story once they got done with it. There were a number of other well-known literary passages that the state had changed, but they were very embarrassed when all the publicity came out, and then the next round of state testing, they did it again. They took the Matthew Arnold poem, the famous poem Dover Beach, and where the line says, "Ah, love, let us be true," they changed it to, "Ah, friend, let us be true." Now, I don't understand why they did that. What's bad about saying, "Ah, love, let us be true"? I don't know. The National Council of Teachers of English, I've discovered, says you're not supposed to use the word guys. You're not supposed to come into a room and say, "Hello, guys." You can't say that anymore. In Massachusetts, as you probably are all aware, the reference to a snow day was considered regional bias, and the test has to be re-given because some children may not know what a snow day is because they haven't had a snow day. That's very much like the stories that I saw that were banned because A child can't imagine what it's like to see an ocean unless they've seen an ocean. And I was talking about this not so long ago on some talk show where someone said, hey, come on, you know, supposing a kid hasn't seen a snow day. And I said, I grew up in Texas. We never had snow, but I knew what snow was. It's not that hard. If you read and you assume that children actually have imaginations, you can believe in the possibility of snow even if you've never seen it. I learned recently from someone who writes for textbooks, who sent me an email and said that an excerpt from The Little House on the Prairie was rejected by the state of Minnesota because the excerpt said that the travelers had to circle the wagon to protect the children and the animals. And the question was, why were they circling the wagons and who were they protecting them from? And this is an offensive passage to the people that they were protecting them from. So that passage was out. Then I, the other day, found that my book had been reviewed in the Scotsman in Scotland, and I didn't want to write to the Scotsman and tell them that they have to change the name of their newspaper. But they pointed out in this article, they interviewed a woman in Scotland who writes for children's books, and she had been selling stories to American textbook publishers. And she said she had a story in which a child was illustrated sitting on Grandpa's lap. And the American textbook publisher came back and said, you have to change this illustration. It implies incest. So she changed the figure to a child sitting on Grandma's lap, which was okay. And I couldn't help but think of an old expression that I saw long ago, Oni soit qui mal y pense. Evil is he who evil thinks. But then someone in the testing business, who will remain nameless, who asked to remain nameless, sent me the guidelines from the state of Michigan, which I hadn't seen. Michigan, of course, has all the usual subjects that are not allowed to be touched or mentioned on its standardized test. Things like dinosaurs. They also added genetic engineering, which apparently implies evolution. But they said, you can't have reference to flying saucers, aliens, or extraterrestrials, because those things imply evolution too. And I'm still trying to figure that one out. I mean, like, what's a flying saucer and aliens and extraterrestrials got to do with evolution? Anyway, all of this banning, I mean, you could take it all the way back to the mid-19th century when textbook adoption first began, when the South wanted to make sure that there were no unfriendly accounts of the Civil War in their textbooks, and they wanted to make sure that the textbooks referred to the War of Northern Aggression rather than the Civil War. But this most recent sort of high pitch of censorship activity began in the 1970s. Particularly with feminists who wanted to eliminate all references to gender. They wanted to eliminate every word that recognized gender differences, everything that had that three-letter word man, either as a prefix or a suffix. And with their success, other advocacy groups also were involved. Now, the sources of censorship pressures that I have written about in this book are mainly they fall into two camps. One camp is called the right wing, and the other camp is called the left wing. The right wing wants books and stories to portray the ideal world of the past. It's a world in which father works, mother takes care of the home and the children are very obedient. It's a world that's free of any social and economic strife. There are no challenges to biblical authority. There are no references to divorce or religion or alcohol or drugs or fantasy. There's no New Age religion. There's no secular humanism. No one steals or lies, and if they do, they get punished. There are no crimes that are unpunished. The right has managed to kill off reading series by making them controversial, by challenging them in court, or going before state education boards in Texas and California and elsewhere. And the basic strategy is, and this is true with any group, right, left, or any other direction, if you can make a textbook controversial, you can kill it. Holt Basic Readers, which was part of Holt, Reinhardt, and Winston, fought off the challenge from right-wing groups in court, and they won, but they lost because their readers went out of print. The right attacks books like the Harry Potter books, and here's a great paradox. The Harry Potter books happen to be the most popular books in the United States, but they're also the most banned books in the United States. Now, why is that? Two reasons. One, Harry Potter comes from a dysfunctional family. That's a problem. But the other, and it's probably even more important, is there's so much witchcraft in Harry Potter. So these books are very, very strongly objected to and very frequently there are many attempts to ban them. They lead the American Library Association list of banned books. Now, the thing about the right-wing groups and the conservative family groups is they believe in the power of the word. They believe that whatever children read will be a role model for them, and if they read something, they will do whatever it is they read about. If they see a child acting disobedient and disrespecting authority, then their children too will be disobedient and disrespect authority. The censors on the left also believe in the power of the word. They too believe in the power of role modeling. Children should read only about an ideal egalitarian world, and it should be a world as it should be and not as it is. There should be never any dominant gender or race or nation or culture, and neither age nor disability should be considered a disadvantage. Stereotypes and negative words should be stamped out. In the interest of diversity, all differences should be eliminated, and we should pretend they don't exist. And the irony of this is that when you look through the list of the banned words and the list of the banned topics and the list of the banned stereotypes, it doesn't promote diversity. We end up with everyone looking exactly the same. If you look, for instance, at the list of stereotypes that you're not supposed to use in textbooks or on tests, you're not supposed to portray African Americans as great athletes or as great entertainers, and you're not supposed to portray Asian Americans as great students or as having strong family values. You're not supposed to portray Jews as professors or doctors or lawyers. You're not supposed to portray old people as sickly or feeble or needing a cane or a walker. Well, what can you do with old people? It's really good to show people who are older jogging. That's a very important thing that we do. I'm of that age now where I can say that most of the time I like to go up on my roof and repair it. That's my favorite activity. And you can't show reality. You can't show people that reflect society today because there is this fear of stereotyping. Well, given the nature of state textbook adoptions, it's very easy to intimidate publishers. What textbook publishers are most fearful of is controversy, because that's what will kill their series. Even if, like the Holt Company, they win the lawsuit, they lose the book. So the deal that has come out of the controversies of the last 20 years, at least as I've seen it, is the right wing gets to censor topics and the left wing gets to censor words and images. It's a neat deal. Everybody gets to censor everything. So when you look at the textbook adoption process, as I have done, you see that 22 states adopt textbooks for the whole state, and the big two are California and Texas. And over these past 25 or so years, the pressure groups of all sorts, from the right, from the left, and from different advocacy groups, have gained power by coming to the hearings and threatening to make books controversial. And the publishers have so much at stake that they capitulate rather than risk becoming controversial or being rejected. And largely because of this system of state textbook adoption, there are today only 4 mega corporations, 4 conglomerates dominating about 70 to 75% of a $4 billion educational publishing industry. At the time I was writing my book, it was McGraw-Hill, Reed Elsevier, Pearson, and Vivendi. Since then, Vivendi has been sold off its Houghton Mifflin unit. I haven't followed who bought it because it wasn't really relevant. But the relevant point was massive concentration, with each of these companies owning multiple textbook companies and testing companies. Well, in order to dig into these questions, I wanted to find out from publishers what their experience had been. And I contacted people I knew in the publishing industry, and they were very nice and took me to lunch and said, of course we're not going to let you see our files. Do you think we're crazy? You know, we're private companies. We're not going to open our books up to you. You'll just, whatever you say will embarrass us. Well, there were 2 companies where I was fortunate enough to be able to see their files. One was the Holt files. As I mentioned earlier, there was a Supreme Court case in the 1980s involving the Holt basic readers. And so the Holt files, over 2,000 pages, were subpoenaed, and this was the internal correspondence amongst the editors. And these files were a part of the discovery process, and so I was able to get a copy of them, and they make it extraordinary reading. Holt was whipsawed between the right and the left in the 1980s, as they were constantly pressed by feminists to have gender equality. the issue of gender representation became more important than literary quality. One letter from the editor of the series said he was reviewing new stories trying to increase the number of girls in the book, in the books, because it was a series, not just one book. And he said, well, this story gets a plus because it has 2 girls, it has a Latina, the quality of the story is poor, add it. In the published stories of the Holt readers, as they were revised, the gender and the ethnicity of the characters were changed almost at will to meet this goal of 50-50 that was required by both California and then by Texas. In one story, a character was changed from Mrs. J to Mrs. Chang in order to insert an Asian character. In another story called Freddie in the Middle, Freddie became Maggie in the Middle. It was just a gender change, very easy. And then in another story, a grandmother who was totally irrelevant to the story was inserted in order to get an older person in. Well, when Holt got to the Texas hearings, having satisfied California, they got to the Texas hearings and feminists complained that a 1-to-1 representation of male-female was not good enough because they had not counted the animals in the stories. And they said that Mr. Rabbit was just as influential to a girl's self-esteem as any other male character. Well, the Holt files were fascinating. I put them, I have stashed them in a place where they're open to the public in the Hoover files. The Hoover Institution has archives, and I put them in the Hoover archives. Another set of files came from Open Court. And the reason I was able to get the Open Court files was that Open Court was sold around 1990. It used to be an independent company, and in the great consolidation era, it was sold to Macmillan McGraw-Hill. So it's now the original company's files were available to me. I contacted the Karras, who sent me the files, and what I found reading through all of his correspondence about these issues was that Open Court was getting excellent results in teaching reading. The Open Court series started out with an intention. It was in the mid-60s that it began. Their intention was to teach traditional myths and folk tales and legends, and they were very quickly under attack by feminist groups as soon as they started because of a lack of gender balance. And California rejected Open Court for their lack of gender balance and for their old-fashioned content. The state was literally saying to them, you have too many folk tales, too many myths, too many legends, get up to date and have these relevant modern stories. Well, among the things that Open Court did in order to try to meet the California requirements and get adopted was that they changed the little engine that could from a male to a female. So that made California feel better. They were also told by the state that Mother Hubbard was a sexist figure and they should get rid of her. But, you know, again, what you find is that the stereotype issue is one that was very tough for Open Court to deal with because they were trying to teach Greek myths, Roman myths, myths of other cultures, and there are stereotypes. But they sold the company, and now there are no more stereotypes in the Open Court readers. I looked at literature textbooks, and suffice it to say I have a chapter about them. I found them terribly disappointing because literature textbooks today have a tremendous visual clutter. They try to look like web pages. They're very distracting. They're incoherent. There is no effort to teach the literary tradition. Anything that's printed these days is considered literature, and I will not dwell on that because I want to talk a minute or two about the history textbooks. I have a chapter on the history textbooks, and again, history textbooks have always been controversial. The subtitle of my chapter is The Endless Battle. This is nothing new, this story of fighting over history textbooks. The world history textbooks following the California guidelines, which say that everybody has to be treated nicely. Really not, you can't, the way they put it is no negative aspersion or no adverse aspersion on anyone, no adverse treatment. And so the world history texts bend over backwards to treat all cultures as being equivalent. All cultures are great and glorious. There are no invidious comparisons. No culture is more or less advanced than any other culture. Slavery seems to be a European invention. When slavery occurs in the Middle East or Africa, it is portrayed as a means of social mobility, as a means of gaining higher status. It is a benign portrayal. The texts cannot bring themselves to say anything critical of any religion. And consequently, They tell religious origin stories as if they were history. This is one of the worst things about world history textbooks today, particularly the middle grades schools. You will see the origins, fables, and myths treated as if these are documented stories. And then when the world history texts come around to dealing with regimes that are today still in power, they become tongue-tied. So, for instance, when they deal with Ayatollah Khomeini, the story they tell is that there was a corrupt and repressive Shah, and the story usually just ends there. You know, there was a revolution, the Shah was thrown out, and he was replaced by people who wanted to have a strong religious tradition. They do not mention the executions that took place under the Khomeini regime. They do not mention the fatwas or Salman Rushdie or anything of that kind. When the textbooks deal with Mao Zedong, he comes across as a friendly, inclusive leader who listened to the peasants. He cut taxes, he reduced inflation. He built roads and schools and bridges and hospitals. He also killed millions of people, but there were some bad policies. He was a reformer in a hurry. Now, what is troublesome about the world history textbooks is that, with one notable exception, they all have advisory committees made up of representatives of ethnic and religious groups, which tell the publishers what to include and what to leave out pertaining to their own group. You cannot have honest, critical history with this kind of vetting by advocacy groups. So what I found in answer to the quest that I embarked upon was, I think, a very alarming story. It's a story about widespread censorship, which is now treated by state education departments and by the testing industry and by the textbook industry as, quote, the industry standard. Second, what I was alarmed by was the extent to which these practices are hidden from public view. Third, by the dumbing down and the falsification that it causes in textbooks and on test. And I asked myself as I looked through all of this material, how can we possibly transmit any sense of a culture, of a multiculture, of all that we are as a people and all that other peoples in the world are? How can we promote critical thinking when there is so much sanitizing, so much Baudelarizing, and so much censorship behind the scenes? So my suggestions for ending the censorship, and it's not going to happen quickly, but I believe it can happen. First, I think we need an informed public. I think there should be a level of public outrage about all of the censorship. Secondly, I would urge that we stop state textbook adoptions. This is a little bit like closing the barn door after the horse is out of it, and I'm not sure if I just said something that's against some guideline there. But I do think that if we stop state adoptions, it would help to break up the quasi-monopoly that we now have with 4 mega corporations dominating the textbook industry. I believe this is where the pressure groups get their power to harass publishers and to impose the revisions for political reasons. I know that it still goes on because I have all of the complaints and responses from publishers from the last Texas state adoptions. The stack of papers is 2.5 feet high, so it goes on. Secondly, with the stopping of state adoptions, I would hope that we could create and encourage competition for the purchase of school materials. We should have a real marketplace instead of a government procurement system where publishers expect to sell their products, their books, to millions of teachers instead of to a small number of school boards. With a real market and with millions of book buyers, there would be a market for textbook reviewing. There's virtually no textbook reviewing today because the decisions are made by so few people. And third, I would say let teachers choose the books they want to use. And I've had people say to me, well, you can't have those teachers choosing those books. There are 3 million of them. Many of them don't know their subject. They're teaching out of field. And my sense is I would rather trust 3 million teachers than 2 state school boards. Next, I would say we should not end bias and sensitivity reviewing of testing, but I believe that it should be made public. There should be transparency. Those who write these bias guidelines and who implement them should be required to tell the public on their website, whether they're a state education department or a test publisher, what the guidelines are, what words and topics are banned, who sits on these panels, what was deleted, what text they used, and what they censored before they gave it to the students. And last, I would say, and I think it's appropriate to say it in these halls, we need better educated teachers who know how to choose wonderful literature and good history books, not just textbooks, but novels and biographies and poetry anthologies. I don't believe that we should tolerate this language police. I don't think we should tolerate this kind of censorship. We don't need speech codes. We don't need all of these banned words and banned topics. We don't need people who tell us what we should read, what we should think, and what we should say. I, for one, and it may be controversial to say it, but I'll say it anyhow, I've gone this far, I want to be free to speak about the Founding Fathers and about the brotherhood of man, and if somebody else doesn't want to, then they shouldn't do it. I want to laugh when Rex Harrison sings in My Fair Lady, "Why Can't a Woman Be More Like a Man?" You know, I think it's funny. I don't want to see it banned. Enough of the regime of thought control. Let's end it. We don't need it. There's no place for language control in a free society. Thank you.
We ask when you ask questions to please wait for the microphone to be brought to you, or else people watching won't have any idea what the question is.
This whole process sounds terribly inefficient and ponderous, and I'm wondering if anybody's estimated how much extra it's costing school districts to purchase texts to pay for all this stuff, because ultimately the consumer will be the Board of Education that's buying the books.
Well, the short answer is I have no idea what it costs, but I do know that every state education department has this kind of a bias and sensitivity review. The federal government does, all the test publishers do, and frequently materials are subject to more than one, sometimes two, sometimes three. At each level that they're used, they're reviewed yet again, so it's a filtering down. I have no idea of estimating the cost. I'm sure, though, that it's not insubstantial.
It's this one.
Yeah, this is just for C-SPAN.
All right. Is there anybody, it sounds like the problems you're describing sound like a sort of straitjacket on education. Is there anybody that's operating outside the straitjacket? Any independent publishers that get their books to the schools, or is it only these four major publishers?
Well, I said that they do, from what I've read in Education Week and the Wall Street Journal, these four major, they're conglomerates because some of them own multiple publishing houses. They control about somewhere to 70–75% of the market. There are others who are in that niche of 25 to 30%. I have time and again encountered schools and teachers where the teachers are not using textbooks, or if they use them, they're just a reference work. There are a few good textbooks. I'm not damning all textbooks. But I am always inspired when I hear of teachers who assign the whole novel, the whole play, and make sure that they are buying a novel or a play that has not been Baudelarized. I mean, one of the amazing things I discovered was if you read the coda to Ray Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, this is a book about book burning. It's a novel about book burning. He said that he gotten many letters from students at one point years ago saying to him, "Do you realize that there are passages that have been cut out of Fahrenheit 451?" And he went back and he checked what was being sold against what he wrote, and he found 75 deleted passages, and he went ballistic. I quoted his reaction to this, but he said he changed publishers and made sure that everything was restored. So part of the problem here is it's not just textbooks, but very often the mass market books that are sold to schools have been sanitized. Shakespeare is frequently sanitized. Others have discovered that there are 300 lines that are usually cut out of Romeo and Juliet because they're too sexy. I mean, the idea of our kids being concerned about sex in Shakespeare is beyond my imagination.
I have a question about what the current climate in terms of accountability foretells for testing, because there is increased pressure now on states and localities to use tests. So what are your comments or thoughts about that?
Well, I don't think that increased accountability has to mean increased censorship. What I learned was that this whole enterprise has been carried on in the dark for many, many years. Even when there was very little accountability, the censorship was becoming systematized. So it's not a result of an increased pressure for testing. It's a result of all of those other pressures, you know, the censorship groups all finding how easy it was to intimidate publishers and state education boards. But I would hope that the increased accountability will give increased visibility to this process of censorship. And my fear is that state education departments will simply avoid using classic literature for the same reason that I was told by the head of Riverside Publishing that everything written before 1970 contained bias. I think that, you know, I hate bias. It's awful. Kids have to learn to grapple with it. They grapple with it on television. They grapple with it in the movies. They see it. And then when you come to school and see that everything is somehow sweet and nice, to me it has two effects. One is that it generates boredom, and the other is it generates cynicism, because they know that the world is not sweet and nice. And when there is bias, they have to learn how to confront it and deal with it and diffuse it.
My question, a couple. How would you describe the owners of these book companies? Two, what do you think the effect of rap or hip-hop language might have in terms of learning? And lastly, I feel blessed that my child has an African-American social studies teacher who makes sure there's no sanitization, both in the selection of the book as well as his update. And for us, I think that is the answer. People who are well-informed and well in touch with the subject, even from a personal experience, as well as, in other words, I don't try to teach you your history when you know your history better than I do.
The first question you asked me was who owns these big corporations? They're public corporations, and this is also another reason, whether they were public or private, you know, they're owned by stockholders, and they don't want controversy. It's the nature of the textbook business that controversy kills your product. It's an interesting difference between general publishing, like this is, my book's published by Knopf. If I can create huge controversies, I'll sell more books. In the textbook business, if you get a huge controversy, your book is dead. So that's the stranglehold that the censorship groups have.
Can you wait just a minute?
Thanks. Okay, go ahead. You're just talking to that one, that's fine.
I'm curious, since I think not only for me, but for most of the people in the room, the efforts to censor are so ludicrous. They're so patently, how shall I say, silly, that I wonder what has been the reaction to your publication. Now, the book is new, but you have surely published shorter pieces elsewhere and so on. How are people responding to this kind of thing? Aren't they ashamed?
Well, you know, the only thing I can gauge it by is the response a year ago when there was a front page story in the New York Times saying that the Regents exams had been sanitizing important literature. And there was the general response, let's say, from the public was ridicule. And so the state education department, as I said we won't do it anymore, but they're still doing it a little bit. They're doing it a little bit now. And I think basically what they're doing is not using passages that need to be sanitized, which is in a way scary because it means that it's a different level of censorship. The response to my book has been extraordinary. You know, as an author, I must say this, I've always done somewhat scholarly books, and this is a different level of response. You know, fortunately, writers respond, and writers hate censorship. And so the reviews have been superb. How do textbook publishers respond? I haven't heard from them yet. But I am getting, as I said, I'm getting emails from people who work in the textbook industry and who work in the testing industry saying, I've been doing this for years, and I am so glad that you brought this out to the public because I couldn't do it. And people have been sending me more and more examples of censorship that they know of. I was sent the other day, someone in the testing industry sent me a number of stories that had been eliminated during the bias review, and one of them was a long poem by not a famous author, but a contemporary author, and it had the word prayer in it. It wasn't about praying, it just had the word prayer, and so the whole thing was thrown out. But there were a number of stories, you know, similar kinds of thing. A word, a phrase, the whole thing had to go. It's very silly. And that's why I think the light of day would be such a curative here, because with most of these things, the publishers, like I had the experience with several of the major publishers where I wrote and said, can I see your bias guidelines? And they said, oh, we don't do that. In fact, in the this area. In the Boston Herald, there was a story about my book, and so the reporter went to a representative from Harcourt, and they said, oh, we don't censor anything. We use bias and sensitivity review, and we make sure not to censor. Well, that's exactly what they're doing, is applying these guidelines. And I saw the Harcourt guidelines, and they look just like everyone else's guidelines. Eliminate these words, these topics, these phrases, these images.
What I wanted to ask is, some of the practices by publishers sound illegal, for example, under intellectual property laws, or plagiarism, or even freedom of speech. Who gives the publisher permission to remove words from Kafka's story, which has royalty? Somebody has rights to that property, intellectual property. How do they get over that? Can that be used back to prevent this happening?
Well, that's a very good question, and it would not be a problem with Kafka, because Kafka is no longer copyrighted, but the New York State Education Department on the Regents exams did literally change words in copyrighted material without asking the author. There were a number of contemporary writers. One is Ernesto, I forget his last name, I'll mispronounce it, Galarzo, I think. It was a story called Barrio Boy. And he used words like, he referred to a woman as a gringo, and they said gringo is not acceptable, so they changed the word gringo to American lady. And then he referred to another student as fat, and they changed that word to heavy. I mean, they were just at will going through someone's copyrighted literature, a short story, and changing words because they thought someone would find it offensive to be referred to as heavy or fat. So yes, you're right. I think there is a legal issue, and but I would imagine that the only one who could bring that kind of action would be the author themselves.
You said near the end of your talk that you would not entirely eliminate DIF analysis and bias analysis from testing as opposed to textbooks. What role do you think there is for some limited amount of review of that kind of material, and how would you have it implemented so that it doesn't mushroom into the monstrosity that you've described here?
That's a very good question, and you bring up the DIF analysis, and DIF is differential item functioning, and the idea is that you could identify items that operate differently on a test for one group as against another group. And that's a whole big discussion which I deal with very briefly in my book. The research on the effects of sensitivity analysis is very slender as far as I could tell. I am still looking for any research that will prove to me that if a student sees a story about a rat or a mouse, that the student won't be able to function and do the test. I guess I could be persuaded if there were research, but I've never seen the research. As far as the DIF analysis goes, which says this question functions better for boys than it does for girls, so remove everything having to do with the military because girls don't know anything about the military, they can't answer those questions. I believe that these views about military and sports had to do with a different era. Women are in the military, women play sports. It's a whole new world, but all of these assumptions were locked into place 25 years ago. So I suspect that the other thing that I learned is that when the DIF analysis is applied, it doesn't affect test scores anyway. It's such a tiny % of questions where there is any of this kind of difference shown that boys will do better about military questions than girls. And I really do think that boys and girls should be able to answer the same kinds of questions, and if they don't, then it doesn't seem to make that much difference in terms of their test scores. But what I would really think is terribly important is the idea of transparency. Continue the bias and sensitivity review, but make it public. Put it out there so that everyone, reporters, researchers, the public, can say, what words are you banning? What lingo is considered inappropriate on a test? And if it's ridiculous, then open it up to ridicule. If it's serious, then you know, take the words out, but make your case.
Hi. I don't know if I have a question, but I have a thought. I'd like to see what you think about it. You know, I'm listening to all of this, and you know, it just seems to me like textbooks aren't the way to go. And as I'm listening to you talk, you've made a couple comments about how, you know, what the good teacher does. I'm a school psychologist. I see all types of teachers. And you know, so if we're sitting here in this seat and we're, you know, listening to you, or we, you know, go so far to actually buy the book, then do we really want something to change? And if we do, then who are we going to try to impact? Are we going to try to impact the principal or the local, you know, school board, who is pretty hard to impact? But if we're at least just trying to establish how should it be done, which is why I came to this talk rather than go swimming, it seems to me that the textbook is just crap anyway. The whole idea of it is a failure, and that if you really do have a good teacher, they aren't going to be relying on this textbook very much at all. In fact, the textbook is almost a burden. And if you think about what happens here at the School of Ed, which I haven't been to in years, but anyway, when I was here, there were a couple of textbooks, but mainly, you know, the really hot teachers had readings and this kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, I think that your thought is a good thought, and I'm glad you came here instead of going swimming. You can still go swimming later.
Yeah, maybe.
But I would suggest that people who teach literature should use literature, and they should help children develop standards of judgment as to what is really wonderful poetry. What I didn't like about the literature textbooks that I just thought was awful is they don't make any effort to say this is what good writing looks like, because they include so much bad writing, and so they don't really encourage a sense of standards about this. This is a wonderful way to use the language that we have. Instead, there was one literature textbook had part of a script from Xena Warrior Princess. Not great literature. And they're just overburdened with all sorts of social studies articles and science articles and issue articles and how to review and how to preview and how to, it's like they took all the teacher's instructions and put them into the student book. So I would say if I would hope literature teachers would look for the best plays, the best novels, the best poetry, and give their students a sense of what best is, the things that would move them to excitement, to tears, to a sense of, I love this and I want to read it again, that kind of feeling. I didn't see that in the literature textbooks. The history textbook struck me as probably the worst way to learn history, because so much of it has been just boiled down to choppy sentences, disconnected, one thing after another. And it's, gosh, you know, there's so many wonderful histories written for young people, written for students of different ages, and wonderful biographies that I think good teachers will, I would hope, would select from real writing by one writer. I mean, one of the ideas I had was maybe teachers should use two different textbooks so that students understand that not everyone agrees. I mean, to me, that was the biggest thing that I hated in the history textbooks, was the sense of, you're now hearing the voice of disembodied authority. This is like reading an encyclopedia. This is truth. Well, it's not truth. Everything that they say in the history textbooks is highly contested, but you don't have the sense of the contest. You don't have the debate. You don't have the argument. You just get a lot of dead facts that have been strung together. So, yes, I think there is a message here.
And do you think in other countries, in Europe, I mean, I don't know, in Canada, is the textbook a big thing there like it is here?
Well, I haven't studied other countries, so I can't say. But I did recently read on the internet a study from a professor somewhere in England who said that history is being rewritten to make it nicer. And he said that it used to be that we taught that the Vikings raped and pillaged. Now we describe the Vikings as agents of cultural exchange. And it's funny because I got an email from someone who heard this, and he said, I'm a member of the Society of Creative Anachronism. I'm a descendant of the Vikings, and I can assure you we were not only agents of cultural exchange, we also raped and pillaged.
The Language Police, How Pressure Groups Restrict What Students Learn, is published by Knopf, a division of Random House. Visit randomhouse.com/Knopf to get more information.
To many other books, some of them historical and some of them about education policy. And she tells me she's about to do a book with her son on English poetry, right? Diane has lectured all over the world. She has collected honorary degrees all over the country, and she has accumulated an innumerable number of honors that I am not going to bore you with. She is going to talk tonight about her newest book, The Language Police, which, as always with Diane, started out with a fairly simple question and just became quite a saga. Diane.
Thank you. Well, it's great to be here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and I thank Drew Faust and especially my old and dear friend Ellen Lageman. As Ellen mentioned, we were graduate students together, but what she didn't tell you was that I started graduate school 12 years later than she did, so she is excused from being a member of my generation. Well, I'm here tonight at their invitation to speak about the language police. I have to say, first of all, I had so much fun writing this book. It's never happened to me before as a historian to actually wake up in the morning and be excited about what I was going to write about, because I did something that I had never done before. I wrote the book in the first person, and it became, for me, a detective story. And I have to explain how this came to be. I think that I stumbled across a major scandal in American education. It involves censorship and speech codes and big business and state policies that limit competition and the political activities of pressure groups that dumb down textbooks and tests. And how this came about was that in 1997, President Clinton decided, and he announced in his State of the Union address, that he thought there should be a voluntary national test in both 4th grade reading and 8th grade math. And he assigned the development of this, what was called the VNT, the Voluntary National Test, to the National Assessment Governing Board. As it happened, he appointed me to that board, and I joined it in the first meeting of 1998. And the board immediately began reviewing test questions for the Voluntary National Test. Now, the Voluntary National Test never came to be because Congress never authorized it. Everybody except the public hated the idea. It showed very well in the opinion polls, but Democrats didn't like the idea, Republicans didn't like the idea, and it just didn't go anywhere. But I learned something that to me was incredible. I was on the committee reviewing test questions, test passages for 4th graders, and we were reading passages, stories that were 2 and 3 pages long, that 4th graders would read and that questions would be based on. And our committee, which was composed of, I don't know, a dozen or so people, educators for the most part, read the passages, approved them, and about a year later, a bunch of these passages were returned to us, and we were told that they had to be eliminated because they had not passed what was called a bias and sensitivity review. And this was news to me. I knew nothing about bias and sensitivity review, but let me tell you some of the stories that we were told couldn't be included and why they couldn't be included. One was a history of peanuts, and it was about George Washington Carver and the cultivation of the peanut. And it seemed like a pretty nice story, but the Bias and Sensitivity Review panel said that we couldn't include it because some children are allergic to peanuts. And so that story had to go. That children would be very sensitive, they wouldn't be able to complete the test, things like that. Then there was a story.
The Language Police is a new book from former Assistant Secretary of Education, Diane Ravitch. She spoke about it recently at Harvard University for about an hour.
On behalf of Drew Faust, who is Dean of the Radcliffe Institute of Advanced Studies, and my colleagues here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, I am delighted to have the opportunity to introduce Diane Ravitch. Diane and I were graduate students together, and I won't tell you how long ago it was, but it was quite a long time ago, at Teachers College. And we've remained in touch ever since. And one summer we even rented houses next door to each other on Martha's Vineyard. Diane is a person of tenacious curiosity. Her first book, The Great School Wars, grew out of a fairly straightforward question Diane had about the New York City public schools. And in pursuit of those fairly straightforward questions, Diane not only wrote a book, which after she wrote it and published it became her dissertation at Columbia. She doesn't always do things in the correct order. But in addition to resulting in a book, her question introduced her to Lawrence Kremen, who became her and my mentor. Currently, Diane is a research professor at the Steinhardt School of Education at NYU, and she also holds the Brown Chair in Education Policy at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. She serves on the National Assessment Governing Board, having served earlier under the first President Bush as Assistant Secretary of Education. Diane's tenacious curiosity has led not only to the Great School Wars, which I think remains, almost 30 years later, the definitive history of education in New York City, but
about the owl and how the owl had a kind of radar that allowed it to find its prey at night. And they said this story could not be included because there are some cultures in this country to whom the owl is taboo. It represents death. And therefore, owls should never again be represented on standardized tests. So the owl doesn't exist anymore as far as standardized test makers are concerned. A third story, which was a true story, was about a young man who was blind, who became the first blind man to ascend Mount McKinley. I point out that he was not the first blind person to ascend Mount McKinley because a blind woman had ascended it before him. However, he was the first blind man to ascend Mount McKinley. He did so in an ice storm, and it was presented as a rather heroic tale that accented his courage. The bias and sensitivity reviewer said this passage could not be used, first of all, because it contained regional bias. Children who had never been in an ice storm couldn't possibly understand what one was. And secondly, it was offensive to blind people because it suggested that it required courage on his part to climb Mount McKinley in an ice storm. And blindness should not be considered a handicap for these purposes. Then there was a story about it was a story about women in the 19th century and how they taught their daughters to make quilts. And it said that quilting was very important because it became part of the daughter's dowry. There were no commercially produced quilts, and so this was an important mother-daughter activity in the 19th century. And they said this story was gender biased. It showed women as soft and submissive and had to be eliminated. It was historically accurate, but that was irrelevant. Then there was a story, and it was a short biography of a man named Gutzon Borglum. He was the man who designed the sculptures on Mount Rushmore. And it was just a story of his life and how as a little boy he wanted to grow up to do monumental sculptures, and he did. And the bias and sensitivity reviewer said this story could not be used because Mount Rushmore was built on land that was sacred to the Lakota Indians, and it would offend Lakota children if Mount Rushmore was represented on a standardized test. So out it went. Then there was a wonderful environmental story about how a rotting stump in the forest is home to many different kinds of insects and animals. And it becomes, they called it the rotting stump apartment house, and how this was a way that nature recycles for all different kinds of creatures in the forest. And they said this had to go because it would be offensive and demeaning to children who live in housing projects. It seems to me that there are a lot of high-rise apartment buildings that are really expensive, but that was not relevant. And there were many other stories, but just one more that I'll mention. It was a story about Mary McLeod Bethune, who was an African-American woman who was a great educator, and it told the story of how she started a school in Daytona Beach, Florida. It was called the Daytona Industrial and Training School for Negro Girls, and it told her story, and they said this story could not be used for two reasons, actually for more than two reasons, but I'll only give you two. One is the name of her school, which used the word Negro, was offensive and could not be used. And the other was that it said that she was a tremendous fundraiser. She even managed to get money from John D. Rockefeller, who was apparently wintered in Daytona Beach. And the bias and sensitivity reviewer said we couldn't use that story because it showed her as dependent upon people like John D. Rockefeller and other white industrialists, and this was demeaning to Mary McLeod Bethune. It was true, but that was, again, irrelevant. So I found myself very puzzled about, where did this definition of bias and sensitivity come from? And I realized that while we were discussing this voluntary national test for reading, the public